You
He
shouldn't
thought
have done
stealing
that.
bread was the
I
crime,
had to.
until
I
he
had no
learned what
choice.
hunger really
You're
costs.
breaking my heart,
The sun
girl.
hung low over
You're
Red
breaking
Hollow,
my heart.
bleeding gold through the dust that never seemed to settle. And Ethan Cole stood in the middle of Main Street with one hand wrapped tight around a girl's wrist, and the other holding a warm loaf that still smelled like fresh yeast and would smoke. The kind of bread that could make a man forget his troubles for a minute, and the kind no one in this town could afford to lose. Not this season, not after months without rain. And yet there she was, Clara Hayes, thin as a fence rail, clothes worn down to threads, staring not at Ethan, not at the crowd gathering around them, but somewhere past it all, like none of it belonged to her anymore. And Ethan felt that familiar certainty settle in his chest, the kind that came from years of living by rules that didn't bend, rules that kept a man honest in a place where everything else tried to break him. And he said it plain so everyone could hear. Law is law. His voice steady, leaving no room for argument, and a few heads nodded. A few voices murmured agreement, because in Red Hollow, order was the only thing standing between survival and chaos, and theft, no matter how small, meant trouble, meant cracks in the thin wall holding everything together. But Clara didn't fight, didn't plead, didn't even try to explain, and that silence pressed against Ethan in a way he didn't like, because most folks talked when they were caught, most folks begged, and when she didn't, it made the moment stretch longer than it should have, until someone laughed, until someone kicked at the dirt where the loaf slipped from Ethan's grip and landed with a soft thud, until boots shuffled and the bread was crushed without a second thought. And still she said nothing, just lowered her eyes for a second before lifting them again, not defiant, not broken, just empty. And Ethan told himself that emptiness didn't matter, that rules didn't care about reasons. And yet as the sheriff stepped forward to take her, something small shifted at the edge of Ethan's vision. A boy standing near the hitching post, no more than 8, arms wrapped tight around his stomach like he was holding something in place. And he wasn't crying, wasn't calling out, just watching Clara being led away with a look that didn't fit a child, a look too quiet, too knowing, and Ethan turned away from it, because he'd seen enough hardship to know it wore many faces, and it wasn't his job to read them, only to keep things straight, only to make sure the line between right and wrong stayed where it was supposed to be, even if it felt thinner than ever beneath his boots. The town went quiet the moment Clara Hayes disappeared behind the sheriff's door, like a storm had passed, but left something unsettled hanging in the air. And Ethan Cole stood there longer than he needed to, staring at the crushed bread in the dust, its warmth already fading, its purpose gone, and he told himself it was done, that order had been restored, that he had done what any man in his place should do. But that image of the boy near the hitching post would not leave him, the way those small arms had wrapped around his stomach like he was holding himself together, the way he had not made a sound. And Ethan had seen hunger before, real hunger, the kind that hollowed a person out from the inside. And something about it did not sit right, not with the way Clara had stood there without a word, not with the way she had not even looked at the bread when it fell. And so instead of heading back to his ranch like he should have, he found himself walking down the narrow road that led away from the center of Red Hollow, past the last of the wooden storefronts, past the broken fence lines where the land turned dry and stubborn, where folks who had nothing left went to be forgotten, and the wind picked up out there, carrying the smell of dust and old wood and something thinner, something like emptiness. And he followed the faint marks in the dirt, small footprints mixed with deeper ones, leading him toward a shack that leaned to one side like it had given up standing straight years ago. And he slowed as he approached, not because he was afraid, but because something in his chest had started to tighten in a way he could not explain. And the door hung open just enough for him to see inside, shadows stretching long across the floorboards. And for a moment he considered turning back, telling himself it was none of his business, that he had done his part. But then he heard it, a quiet sound, not quite a cry, not quite a word, just a thin breath of something that should not have been there if everything was as simple as he had believed. And that was enough to make him step forward, pushing the door open with a slow, careful motion, the wood creaking under his hand. And what he saw inside did not match the story he had told himself, not even close, because the boy from the street was there, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, his eyes lifting just enough to meet Ethan's for a second before dropping again. And beside him another child, smaller, curled up under a thin blanket that did nothing to keep out the cold, and in the far corner, a man lay stretched out on a makeshift bed, his breathing shallow, his frame so still it took Ethan a moment to realize he was alive at all, and the room held no food, no supplies, nothing but the kind of silence that came from going too long without either, and Ethan stood there, not moving, not speaking, just taking it in piece by piece as the certainty he had carried all day began to shift, just slightly, like a foundation that had seemed solid until the first crack appeared. The air inside the shack felt heavier than the desert outside, thick with the kind of stillness that came when people had run out of strength to speak, and Ethan Cole remained near the doorway for a long second, his shadow stretching across the floor until it touched the edge of the man lying in the corner, and something about that small detail made him take another step forward, slower this time, more careful, as if the truth inside that room might break if he moved too quickly, and the boy watched him again, those same quiet eyes, not afraid, not angry, just waiting, as if he had already seen everything there was to see in this world and had nothing left to expect from it, and Ethan crouched slightly, his boots pressing into the worn boards, his gaze shifting from the children to the man. And that was when he noticed it, not all at once, but in pieces, the shape of the man's face under the thin light, the line of his jaw, the gray in his beard, the familiar curve of a hand resting weakly against his side, details that did not belong together until they suddenly did. And Ethan felt something inside his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the dry air, because he knew that face, even after all these years, even after time had worn it down to something barely recognizable. And for a moment he said nothing, could say nothing, because the distance between memory and reality had closed too fast, too suddenly, and the boy's voice broke the silence in a way that barely rose above a whisper, asking if he had brought the bread back, not accusing, not pleading, just asking, like it was a simple question with a simple answer. And Ethan did not respond right away, because his eyes were fixed on the man now, the rise and fall of his chest so faint it almost did not exist, and he remembered a different version of that man, standing taller than anyone in Red Hollow, hands steady, voice firm, teaching him how to hold a line, how to stand his ground, how to never take what was not his, and the weight of that memory pressed against the scene in front of him until it no longer made sense, until the rules he had lived by felt thinner than the dust beneath his boots, and the smaller child stirred, slightly under the blanket, a soft movement that drew his attention again, and Ethan realized then that there was nothing here that resembled choice, nothing that resembled wrongdoing, only survival stretched to its breaking point, and he stood slowly, the motion deliberate, his gaze moving back to the boy who had not looked away, and for the first time since he had stepped into that shack, Ethan felt uncertainty settle into his bones, not loud, not sudden, but steady, like something that had always been there waiting for him to notice. And the boy spoke again, quieter this time, saying that Clara would come back soon, that she always did, and Ethan turned toward the open door as the wind moved through it, carrying dust across the floor, and in that moment, the line he had believed in, the one that separated right from wrong, no longer looked straight at all. The wind slipped through the broken edges of the shack, lifting dust into the air like it was trying to erase what Ethan Cole had just seen, but nothing moved inside him the way it should have. Nothing settled back into place. And for a man who had spent his whole life trusting the weight of his own judgment, that silence felt louder than any argument he had ever heard. And he turned his eyes once more toward the man on the bed, toward the face that time had carved into something fragile but still unmistakable. And memory came back in pieces, not loud, not clear, but enough, a hand on his shoulder when he was barely tall enough to reach the saddle, a voice telling him that a man's worth was measured by the choices he made when no one was watching. And Ethan had believed that, had built his life on it, had left it behind when pride and distance grew too wide to cross. And now that same man lay there with nothing, not even the strength to open his eyes, and the truth pressed down on Ethan in a way that did not need words, because he understood it without being told, understood that Clara Hayes had not taken that bread for herself, had not stood silent in the street out of defiance or guilt, but because there had been nothing left to explain, nothing left that anyone there would have listened to. And the boy shifted again, his voice softer now, saying that Clara always brought something back when she could, sometimes bread, sometimes nothing at all, but she always tried. And Ethan felt the weight of that word settle into him. Tried. Simple and small, and somehow heavier than everything he had said earlier that day. And he looked down at his own hands, at the calluses earned from years of work, hands that had held that loaf, that had taken it without hesitation, without question, and for the first time since he had stepped into Red Hollow that morning, Ethan did not feel certain, did not feel steady, and the ground beneath his boots seemed less solid than it had. Just an hour ago, and outside, the light had begun to shift, the sun lowering toward the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched across the dry land. And Ethan knew what that meant, knew that Clara would be brought before the town by morning, judged in the same way everything else in this place was judged, quickly, firmly, without room for anything that did not fit clean and simple. And he turned toward the door again, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if each step carried a weight he had not noticed before. And he paused at the threshold, glancing back one last time at the boy, at the smaller child, at the man who had once taught him everything he thought he knew. And for a moment it felt like the past and the present had folded into the same narrow space, leaving no room for excuses, no room for distance, only a choice that had not been there before, or maybe had always been there waiting for him to see it. And without another word, Ethan stepped out into the fading light, the wind catching his coat as he moved, carrying with it the quiet understanding that whatever came next would not be decided by the rules he had followed all his life, but by something far harder to hold on to, something that did not fit neatly into right or wrong, something that demanded more than certainty ever had. By the time Ethan Cole reached the edge of town, the light had turned thin and copper, stretching long shadows across Red Hollow like the day itself was trying to pull away from what had happened, and the sounds of the street felt distant now, quieter, as if the town had already decided the matter was closed, already moved on. But Ethan had not really, because each step he took carried the weight of something he could not set down, and he slowed near the sheriff's office, the wooden building standing firm in the center like it always had, a place where rules were kept simple and decisions were made without hesitation, and for years that had been enough for him, enough to believe that right and wrong could be measured cleanly, like lines drawn in dust. But now those lines felt blurred, uncertain, like they had shifted without asking him, and he stopped just short of the door, his hand hovering for a moment before lowering again, because he realized something he had not allowed himself to think until now, that walking inside would not just change Clara Hayes's fate, it would change his own, and that truth settled into him slowly, steady as the fading light. And across the street a few men leaned against the railing, talking low, glancing in his direction with the kind of casual interest that came from expecting things to unfold the way they always did, because in Red Hollow, stories did not change, people did not change, and a thief was always a thief. But Ethan could still see that shack, still see the boy's quiet eyes, still see the man lying there between memory and something close to nothing, and the sound of a horse shifting nearby broke his thoughts just enough to remind him where he stood, and he drew a breath, slow and measured, the kind that did not solve anything but made a man aware of the moment he was in. And then the door behind him opened before he could move, the sheriff stepping out with a tired look that softened for just a second when he saw Ethan there, as if expecting confirmation, expecting the same certainty Ethan had carried all day. And the sheriff spoke in a low voice, saying that it would be handled in the morning, that things would stay in order, that nothing needed to be done tonight. And those words hung in the air between them, familiar and easy, the kind that used to bring comfort, but now they felt heavier than they should have, because Ethan knew what morning would bring, knew how quickly a town like this could close a story without ever understanding it. And he looked past the sheriff toward the dim interior, where Clara sat somewhere out of sight, waiting without knowing what waited for her. And for a moment Ethan said nothing, because the choice in front of him did not come with instructions, did not come with the certainty he had always relied on, only with the quiet understanding that whatever he did next would not fit into the rules he had lived by. And the sheriff shifted slightly, waiting, and the town held its breath in that subtle way it always did before something changed. And Ethan finally lifted his eyes, not to the building, not to the men across the street, but somewhere in between, where the weight of his past and the reality of the present met. And in that space, he knew one thing clearly for the first time since the bread had touched his hand, that leaving things as they were would be the easiest choice, and the wrong one. The sheriff's words lingered in the air, simple and steady, the kind that usually settled things before they had a chance to grow complicated. But Ethan Cole did not nod this time, did not step back the way he normally would, and for a moment the two men just stood there in the fading light, one waiting for agreement, the other searching for something he had never needed before. And the silence stretched just long enough to draw attention from across the street, the quiet murmur of voices, shifting as people sensed that something had gone off script. And Ethan finally spoke, but his voice was not as firm as it had been earlier, not as certain, and he said that there might be more to it, that maybe things were not as clear as they seemed. And the sheriff frowned slightly, not in anger, but in confusion, because this was not the man he knew, not the man who had always stood on one side of the line without question. And he asked what Ethan meant, and Ethan did not answer right away, because explaining it would mean putting into words something that did not fit neatly, something that did not sound like law or order, only like doubt. And doubt was not something Red Hollow respected, not something it made room for. And yet it was there, steady as a heartbeat. And Ethan glanced past the sheriff again, toward the dim interior, imagining Clara sitting there alone, still silent, still waiting. And he remembered the boy's voice asking about the bread, remembered the man lying in that shack, the weight of memory and reality pressing into one another until he could not tell where one ended and the other began. And when he looked back at the sheriff, something had shifted in his expression, not softer, not weaker, just different, like a man who had stepped onto unfamiliar ground and chosen to keep walking. Anyway, and he said quietly that he wanted to speak to her, just for a minute, and the sheriff hesitated, not because the request was unreasonable, but because of who it came from, because Ethan Cole had never needed to ask before, had never questioned the process once it had begun, and that hesitation spoke louder than any argument. Drawing another glance from the men across the street, their conversation fading into a watchful silence, and the sheriff finally stepped aside, slow and deliberate, opening the door just enough to allow Ethan through. And the shift in that small action carried more weight than it should have, because it marked a break in something that had always held firm, and Ethan stepped inside without another word, the dim light swallowing him as the door closed behind him. And for the first time that day, he was no longer standing in the certainty of the street, no longer held up by the quiet approval of the town, but alone in a space where answers would not come easy, where the truth, whatever it was, would not fit into the lines he had drawn for himself. And as his eyes adjusted to the darker room, he saw her sitting there, exactly as he had imagined, still, silent, her gaze lifting just enough to meet his. And in that moment, before either of them spoke, Ethan understood something with a clarity that left no room for retreat, that whatever came next would not be about law, not about order, but about whether he was willing to see what he had refused to see before. The room held its breath the moment Ethan Cole stepped fully inside, the door closing behind him with a quiet weight that felt heavier than it should have. And Clara Hayes did not move, did not shift, did not speak. She only watched him with the same stillness she had carried out in the street, the kind that did not ask for anything and did not expect anything in return. And for a moment Ethan found himself without words, which was not something he was used to, because out there, under the open sky, things had always come simple to him, clear and direct. But in here, with the light dim and the air close, nothing felt simple anymore. And he took a slow step forward, his boots soft against the wooden floor, stopping just far enough away to keep the space between them intact, as if crossing it too quickly might break something neither of them could put back together. And Clara tilted her head just slightly, not in curiosity, not in fear, but in quiet acknowledgement, like she had already measured him and found nothing new to consider, and that unsettled him more than anger ever could have, because he realized then that she had already decided who he was, already placed him where the rest of the town had placed him, and there was no reason for her to think otherwise, not after what had happened. And he finally spoke, his voice lower now, not carrying the same edge it had earlier, asking why she had not said anything, why she had stood there in silence when the whole town was watching. And the question hung between them, heavier than he intended, because even as he asked it, he knew the answer might not come in the way he expected, and Clara did not respond right away, her eyes drifting for a second toward the small window behind him where the last of the daylight slipped through, thin and fading, before returning to him. And when she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady, saying that words would not have changed anything, that people hear what they want to hear, especially when they have already made up their minds, and Ethan felt that settle into him deeper than he wanted, because it was not said with bitterness, not with accusation, just with a kind of simple truth that did not need to be raised to be heard. And he shifted his weight slightly, the old certainty pressing against this new understanding, and he asked about the shack, about the children, about the man, each word coming slower than the last. And for the first time Clara's expression changed, not much, just enough to show that something in those questions mattered, and she looked down at her hands for a moment before answering, saying that the children had no one else, that the man had been sick for a long time, that food had been hard to come by even before the drought, and that lately there had been nothing at all, and she did not dress it up, did not try to make it sound like anything other than what it was. And Ethan listened without interrupting, each word fitting into the space where his certainty used to be, replacing it piece by piece. And when she finished, the room fell quiet again, not empty, but full of everything that had been left unsaid, and Ethan realized then that the truth had not arrived all at once, had not struck him like a storm. It had come slowly, steadily, until there was no room left to deny it. And he stood there, facing her, knowing that whatever he said next would not erase what had already been done, would not change the way she saw him, but it might decide what kind of man he chose to be from this moment forward. The silence after Clara Hayes finished speaking did not feel empty. It felt final, like something had settled into place whether Ethan Cole was ready for it or not. And he stood there with the weight of her words pressing against everything he thought he understood, not loud, not overwhelming, just steady enough that he could not ignore it. And for a moment he considered saying something that might balance it, something that might bring the world back to the way it had been before he walked into that shack. But nothing came, because there was nothing he could say that would make what he had done fit into the truth he now saw. And Clara did not look away from him, did not soften, did not accuse. She simply waited, not for an explanation, not for an apology, but as if she already knew that whatever he said would matter less than what he chose to do next. And that realization settled deeper than anything else, because Ethan had always believed that words carried weight, that they defined a man's position. But here, in this quiet room, words felt smaller than they ever had. And he finally moved, not forward, not closer, but slightly to the side, as if shifting his stance might help him see things differently. And he asked one more question, quieter than the rest, asking how long it had been like this. And Clara's gaze dropped for just a second before lifting again. And she said long enough that counting it no longer mattered, long enough that people stopped noticing, long enough that the town learned to look past the edges where lives like theirs existed. And Ethan felt that answer settle into him like dust into cracks, filling spaces he had not known were there. Because he realized then that nothing he had seen today had started today, that this had been there all along, just out of sight, just beyond the lines he had drawn around his understanding of right and wrong. And outside, a voice carried faintly through the walls, someone laughing, someone calling out, the town continuing as it always did, steady and certain. And Ethan turned his head slightly toward the sound before looking back at Clara. And for the first time, the distance between them did not feel like something he needed to maintain. It felt like something he had created without knowing it. And now he could see it clearly, and he understood that stepping across it would not be simple, would not be clean, but it was the only way forward that made any sense. And he drew a slow breath, the kind that came before a decision, not the easy kind, but the kind that changed something permanent. And he reached into his coat, not for anything dramatic, not for anything that would undo what had happened, but for something small, something that might begin to shift the direction of what came next. And he placed it on the table between them, a few folded bills, more than enough to cover what had been taken, more than enough to matter. But he did not push it toward her, did not make a gesture of it. He simply set it down and let it sit there, because this was not about settling a debt. Not really. And Clara looked at the money, then back at him, her expression unchanged. And in that quiet exchange, Ethan realized that what he was offering was not what she needed most, and that understanding stayed with him as he straightened slightly, knowing that the next step would require more than what could be placed on a table, more than what could be explained in a single moment, and that the real weight of this had only just begun to reveal itself. The money sat between them like it belonged to another conversation, one that neither of them was having, and Ethan Cole could see it clearly now, that this was not something that could be settled with bills folded neat and clean, not something that could be balanced the way he had balanced every other problem in his life. And Clara Hayes did not reach for it, did not even glance at it again, her eyes remaining on him with that same quiet steadiness that had followed him since the street. And it was not defiance, not pride, just a kind of understanding that made the space feel smaller, more honest. And Ethan let his hand fall back to his side, the gesture unfinished, because he knew she was right without her needing to say it, that what had been taken could not be returned in the same shape, that something else had been broken the moment he chose not to look deeper. And outside the door, footsteps passed, voices low and familiar, the town moving through its evening like it always did, unaware or unwilling to see what had shifted just beyond its reach. And Ethan found himself listening to those sounds differently now, hearing not comfort but distance, a separation between the life he had lived and the truth standing in front of him. And he spoke again, slower this time, asking what would happen to the children if she did not return tonight. And Clara's gaze flickered just slightly, not enough to hide it, just enough to show that the question mattered more than anything else he had said, and she answered that they would wait, because that is what they always did. That waiting had become part of how they survived, and Ethan felt that settle into him with a weight that did not need to be explained, because he had seen that waiting in the boy's eyes, had felt it in the stillness of that shack, and it was not something that could be left alone until morning, not something that could be postponed to fit the town's sense of order. And he looked back toward the door, the thin line of light beneath it, and for a moment he saw two paths as clearly as he had ever seen anything. One that led back into the familiar rhythm of Red Hollow, where everything would proceed as expected, where Clara would be judged and the town would feel right again, and another that stepped away from all of that, uncertain, unsteady, but closer to something he could not ignore anymore. And the choice did not feel dramatic, did not feel heroic. It felt quiet and unavoidable, like a truth that had already been decided before he admitted it to himself. And he turned back to Clara, meeting her gaze fully this time, not as a man standing on one side of a line, but as someone who had finally seen how thin that line had always been. And he said that he would make sure the children had food tonight, that they would not be left waiting, and the words were simple, but they carried something new in them, something that did not ask for recognition, did not ask for forgiveness, only a chance to begin again in whatever way was still possible. And Clara studied him for a long second, not searching for truth, not testing him, just seeing him as he was in that moment. And when she finally looked away, it was not dismissal, not acceptance, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted. And Ethan understood then that this was only the beginning, that what he had set in motion would not end with one act, one night, or one decision, and that whatever came next would demand more than he had ever given before, not to the town, not to the law, but to the truth he could no longer pretend he had not seen. The door opened with a soft creak as Ethan Cole stepped back out into the cooling night, and the air felt different now, not because the town had changed, but because he had, and the weight of that followed him down the street as he moved with quiet purpose, not fast, not hesitant, just steady in a way that did not need to be seen. And the men across the way watched him pass, their voices lowering, their eyes tracking him with the kind of curiosity that came when something familiar started to shift. But Ethan did not meet their gaze, did not offer explanation, because there was nothing he could say that would make sense to them yet, not when he was still trying to understand it himself. And he headed straight for the general store, the one place in Red Hollow where what a man needed could still be found if he had the means. And the bell above the door gave a soft chime as he stepped inside, the warm scent of flour and dried goods settling around him, a sharp contrast to the emptiness he had just left behind. And the shopkeeper looked up with mild surprise, not expecting business this late. And Ethan spoke plainly, asking for bread, more than one loaf, asking for dried meat, beans, anything that would last, his voice steady but carrying something new beneath it. something that made the shopkeeper pause before moving, as if sensing that this was not a routine purchase. And as the items were gathered, wrapped in rough cloth and set on the counter, Ethan reached for his money without hesitation, placing it down with a quiet finality that needed no discussion. And he gathered the bundle himself, feeling its weight settle into his arms, not heavy by measure, but heavier than anything he had carried that day, because this was not just food, not just supplies. It was a step he could not take back, and when he stepped outside again, the sky had darkened fully, the first stars faint above the horizon, and the town had settled into its evening rhythm, doors closing, lamps glowing behind windows, the world continuing as it always had, and Ethan walked past it all without slowing, his path leading him back toward the edge, toward the place most people chose not to see. And the further he went, the quieter it became, until the sounds of Red Hollow faded behind him, replaced by the low whisper of wind across dry land. And when the shack came into view again, leaning against the dark like it barely belonged to the world at all, Ethan did not stop, did not hesitate. He walked straight to the door and pushed it open, and inside, the same stillness waited, the same quiet breath of survival stretched thin, and the boy looked up first this time, his eyes widening just slightly as he took in the bundle in Ethan's arms. Not hope, not relief, just a shift in something that had been held tight for too long, and Ethan stepped forward, lowering the supplies onto the small table without a word, the sound soft but certain, and for a moment no one moved, no one spoke, and then the smaller child stirred, the blanket shifting, the faintest sign of life, reaching toward something it could not yet trust, and Ethan stood there, watching it all, knowing that this did not erase what had come before, did not balance anything, but it mattered, and in the quiet that followed, he understood that this was the first real thing he had done all day, the first thing that had not come from rule or habit, but from something deeper, something harder to ignore. And as the boy slowly stood, stepping closer to the table, eyes fixed on the food like it might disappear if he blinked, Ethan did not speak, did not explain. He simply stayed where he was, letting the moment unfold without interference, because for the first time, he understood that not everything needed to be decided by him, that sometimes the right thing was not something a man declared, but something he allowed to happen. The boy did not rush forward at first, did not grab the food the way hunger might have demanded. Instead, he stepped closer one slow pace at a time, his eyes fixed on the bundle as if it might vanish the moment he trusted it was real. And Ethan Cole watched that hesitation more closely than anything else, because it said more than words ever could. It spoke of days without enough, of promises that had not held, of learning not to believe too quickly. And when the boy finally reached the table, his hands hovered above the cloth for a second before touching it, light at first, almost careful, like he was testing the truth of it. And then he pulled it closer, unwrapping the edges just enough to reveal the bread, the dried meat, the simple things that should have been ordinary, but were not here, not anymore. And the smaller child stirred again under the blanket, drawn by the scent, by something instinctive that did not need to be explained, and Ethan shifted his gaze toward the corner, where the man lay, the rise and fall of his chest still faint, still steady enough to hold on. And for a moment the past came back sharper than before, not as memory alone, but as something tied directly to what stood in front of him. Because this was not just any man lying there. This was the man who had once stood between Ethan and the world, who had taught him how to stand firm. And now that same strength had been reduced to quiet breaths in a room that most people in Red Hollow would never enter, would never choose to see. And Ethan took a step closer, not toward the table, not toward the children, but toward that corner, his boots soft against the floor, and he stopped just short of the bed, looking down without speaking. Because there was nothing he could say that would bridge the distance between what had been and what was now. And behind him, he heard the faint sound of the boy breaking the bread, the quiet shift of movement as something long denied was finally within reach. And that sound carried a kind of weight Ethan had never noticed before, not when food had always been within arm's reach, not when hunger had been something distant and temporary. And he realized then that this moment, simple as it looked, was not just about survival. It was about time, about how long they had gone without, about how long he had gone without seeing it. And the thought settled deeper than anything else that day, because it did not come with blame, did not come with anger. It came with clarity, and that clarity left no room for turning away. And as he stood there, the quiet of the shack no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like something fragile being held together by small, careful actions, and Ethan understood that what he had started could not end with one visit, one bundle of supplies. It required something steadier, something that lasted beyond a single night. And when he finally turned back toward the children, the boy had already begun to share what he had unwrapped, dividing it without being asked, without hesitation. And that small act carried more meaning than anything Ethan had done so far, because it showed that even in scarcity, something human remained intact, something that did not depend on rules or judgments. And Ethan stood there for a long second, watching it, taking it in, and for the first time since the day began, the weight in his chest shifted, not lifting, not disappearing, but settling into something he could carry, something that would not be set aside when morning came, because he knew now that morning would bring more than just judgment to Red Hollow. It would bring a choice that would not belong to the town alone, and whatever he decided then would shape everything that came after. The night settled deeper around the shack, wrapping the broken walls in a quiet that felt less empty than before, and Ethan Cole remained where he stood, not because he did not know what to do, but because he understood now that every movement carried weight. Every choice reached further than the moment it was made, and the children continued slowly, carefully, eating in a way that spoke of restraint more than hunger, breaking pieces, saving what they could, as if tomorrow had already taught them not to trust today. And Ethan watched that with a stillness he had not known he possessed, because it was not just what they did, it was how they did it, the patience, the quiet understanding between them, and it made everything else feel louder by comparison. The town, the rules, the certainty he had carried like a shield for years, and he turned his attention back to the man on the bed, stepping closer this time without hesitation, lowering himself just enough to see the faint lines of age and memory carved into a face he had once known better than his own. And for a moment, the past and present stood side by side so clearly that it felt like time itself had folded in on him. And he spoke, not loudly, not even expecting an answer, just a quiet acknowledgement that the man was not alone anymore, that he had been seen, and the words did not matter as much as the act of saying them, because they were not for the man, not entirely. They were for Ethan himself, a way of stepping across the distance he had allowed to grow for too long. And behind him, the boy shifted again, his voice low but steady, saying that Clara would not know about this yet, that she would come back expecting nothing. And Ethan let that settle into him, because it meant something simple and heavy at the same time, that what he had done here would remain unseen by the one person who might have understood it most. And that thought did not trouble him the way it might have before. It felt right, in a way that did not need acknowledgement, and he rose slowly, turning toward the door once more, the weight in his chest no longer sharp, no longer uncertain, but firm in a different way, like something he could stand on rather than something that might give way beneath him. And outside, the first hint of dawn was already beginning to press against the horizon, faint and distant, but certain, and Ethan knew what that meant. Knew that morning would bring the town back into motion, would bring Clara back into the center of it, and with it, a decision that could not be avoided. And he paused at the threshold, looking back one last time at the small room, at the children, at the man who had shaped him in ways he was only now beginning to understand. And he did not linger, did not hesitate, because whatever came next would not be decided here, it would be decided out there, in front of the same people who had watched him earlier that day. And this time, he would not stand where they expected him to stand. And as he stepped into the early light, the wind carried across the land once more, not harsh, not empty, but steady, like something waiting to see which way he would turn when the moment came. Morning came slow over Red Hollow, the kind of light that did not rush, that revealed things piece by piece whether a man was ready to see them or not. And Ethan Cole stood in the center of town once more, in the same place where certainty had guided him the day before, only now that certainty was gone, replaced by something quieter, something that did not need approval to stand. And the people gathered again, drawn by habit more than curiosity, forming that familiar circle where judgment was. Past and stories were closed, and Clara Hayes was brought forward, her steps steady, her silence unchanged. and for a moment it felt like everything would unfold the same way it always had, like nothing had shifted at all. But Ethan could see it now, the space between what they believed and what was true, and it no longer looked invisible. It stood there as clear as the dust beneath their boots, and the sheriff glanced toward him, waiting without saying it, expecting the same voice that had spoken the day before, the same man who had drawn the line without hesitation, and the crowd waited too, not restless, not impatient, just certain, because certainty had always belonged to them. And Ethan stepped forward before the silence could settle, not fast, not forceful, just enough to change where the moment stood. And when he spoke, his voice did not carry the weight of law this time. It carried something else, something harder to define but impossible to ignore. And he said that the bread had not been stolen the way they believed, that it had been taken for a reason that none of them had chosen to see. And a ripple moved through the crowd, quiet but unmistakable, not disagreement, not yet, just the sound of something unfamiliar entering a place that did not welcome it. And Ethan did not raise his voice, did not argue. He simply told them what he had seen, the shack, the children, the man, not as a defense, not as a plea, but as truth placed in the open where it could not be ignored. And for a moment no one spoke, because the simplicity of it left no room for easy answers, and the sheriff's expression shifted, not in defiance, but in thought. And Clara stood as she had before, silent, watching, not surprised, not relieved, just present in a way that did not depend on the outcome. And Ethan felt the weight of every eye on him, the expectation that he would step back, that he would let the town return to what it understood. But he did not, because he knew now that stepping back would not restore anything worth keeping. It would only hide what he had already seen. And so he said one more thing, quieter than the rest, that if they chose to call it theft, then they would have to accept what that meant about themselves, about the kind of place they had become, and that settled over them in a way no argument could have, because it did not accuse, it did not demand, it simply revealed, and one by one, the certainty that had filled the space began to loosen, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. And the sheriff lowered his gaze for a moment before looking back up, his voice measured as he said that there would be no charge, that the matter was finished. And the crowd did not cheer, did not protest. They simply stood there, quiet in a way that felt different from before, as if something had shifted just enough that it could not be returned to its place. And Clara was released without a word, stepping past Ethan without stopping, without acknowledgement. And he did not follow, did not call out, because he understood that this was not something that needed to be spoken between them. And as the town slowly began to disperse, the lines of the day dissolving back into routine, Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, watching the dust settle, feeling the weight of what had changed and what had not. And when he finally turned away, it was not with the certainty he had once carried, but with something steadier, something earned, because out here, justice had not come from force or from rule. It had come from a man choosing to see and choosing not to look away.